Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if I've ever gotten a better introduction. Thank you. Nice to see all of you. Malai Lakshmanan from LinkedIn. You know, in a room full of technologists and technology enthusiasts, I'm sure you'll agree with me that we are actually on the cusp of some exciting, maybe even some unsettling times in human history. Artificial intelligence is not science fiction anymore, unless you were living under a rock. AI is everywhere, and it's actually starting to reshape the way we work and we live. Do we feel we are ready for this? This question is actually even more important right here in India. Why? Because until recently, every economist in the world was actually asked, you know, what is the biggest edge India has, right? And the answer was the demographic dividend, which is the age group of like 35 and below coming into the workforce. With so much disruption happening and the onset of AI, I feel like this is a moment of reckoning for India as to how we lead our teams, our organizations, and our country through this change. While I was actually thinking about this topic, I'm a history buff, so I decided to just look up history and say, is there anything that we can learn from history? And sure enough, there is. Okay. Like I said, I went back in history and I was looking for something that we can learn from, right? And I saw this interesting piece on electricity. So electricity was actually, invented like in the mid-1800s. In the 1880s, it was a proven source of power, and generators were running. But still, the technology for decades wasn't actually adopted really well. And how long did it take? 40 years. 40 years. Until 1920s, it was not adopted, right? What were the reasons, right? It is not because people didn't believe in electricity. It is because the center of how they were operating in those days, mainly the factories, was actually reliant on one giant central steam engine, which powered the factories. So given that that is something they had to change, it took a lot of time. They had to change the layouts. They had to change the, retrain their folks. They had to do so many different things to actually make this happen. And it actually required leadership. It required culture change for them to go through this. Now, let's actually see where we are. Obviously, the breakthroughs happen. As all of you would agree with me, we are in the early adoption cycle of the AI revolution. Now, what do we think the timeline is going to be? I don't think any of us would know. But one thing we can probably all agree on is it's not going to take another 40 years, right? Now, given that, I actually did some comparison to see what was actually parallel and what was strikingly parallel and what is different, right? If you think about certain things that are common, actually, when it started, the revolutions, it clearly meant that there were foundational technologies that were going to change literally every other industry in the world, right? Make no mistake. Both electricity and AI were very similar in that front. Then, when initially they came on and they started to scale in adoption, they were actually met with a level of sarcasm, right, initially, in terms of like, hey, skepticism, sarcasm, what is it going to do, right? The next thing is, the way these technologies were evolving, people actually were nibbling at the bits, right? Like in the old days, they were actually throwing probably like a motor at the end instead of like really attacking the steam engine in the middle. Similarly, I'm sure a lot of you can relate, in organizations and in some teams, they're nibbling at the bits instead of doing a rethink by saying, hey, can we actually just throw in a chatbot that can actually go cover this piece, right? And do a Gen AI piece here. So those are some of the similarities in how they are. Obviously, when you come to the differences, the first thing that comes to mind is the pace of adoption, right? It took several decades for them to go from 0 to 100 million, whereas, as most of us know, 0 to 100 million for ChatGPT was only a couple of months, right? The other thing that's different now, and why it feels a lot more palpable, in my opinion, is, it used to be that a lot of the revolutions would happen in the West and then slowly trickle down to the rest of the world, right? For the very first time, I feel like most of the globe is actually in on it at the same time, and that energy is actually palpable when you see a lot of data that I'll share with you on, right? So given these striking differences and the similarities, one thing that I want to say is, the way AI is actually going to impact individuals, organizations, and countries is of like paramount importance. I mean, all of us probably, I don't know if we'll see anything like this again. So it's important to see how we can actually set ourselves up our organizations and the country up for success. For something like this, wouldn't it be great to actually have like a crystal ball that actually tells us how are actually all of these folks changing? How are they transforming, right? And at LinkedIn, we have just that. It's called the LinkedIn Economic Graph. It's actually a graph that's built on all of these pillars. As you can see, huge amount of data we have. By the way, it is not just a static graph. It's actually a dynamic graph, right? So every minute on LinkedIn, this is what is happening. 70,000 connections are formed. Close to 10,000 people apply for a job. 148 hours of learning. Every single minute this is, right? Close to 2 million feed updates that people are viewing, and 90 people add a new role, right? All of this is happening in a minute on LinkedIn. Now, given what we have, it's not just about what we are seeing, but where the professional world is going, right? So we're able to see what are the skills that are coming up, what wasn't there before, what are the jobs, what type of courses are institutions offering, right? All of this is actually visible. Now let's take a look at like a couple of data points that are actually, very telling from an AI perspective, right? So if you look at, 2016, this is less than a decade, right? Less than a decade, 36% of the skills for jobs have changed. 36%. Less than a decade. If you think about that number is actually big, wait until you see this, right? It's projected to change 70% by 2030. 70%. Let that sink in, right? I mean, we talk about folks' careers being like, 35 years and so on. So in 15 years, 70% of your job is changing. By the time all of us finish, how we started is going to be very different than how we end our careers, right? That is the amount of change that's happening. Now, when we talk about when skills are impacting, let's talk about jobs, right? The expectation is 90 million plus jobs will be displaced, right? This is the reality. When I say there's the unsettling feeling, that is because of this. But here's the brighter side of the coin, right? 170 million jobs are going to be created. 170 million. That is the brighter side of this, right? Now, if you think about from an individual's perspective, they're wondering, okay, all of this is great, Malai. What is it that I should keep in mind, right? Like, how should I think about my career? Now, let me start with my own personal journey, right? I actually am a mechanical engineer by, my education. While I was doing my engineering, it was not another 4-year engineering course. It was a 5-year mechanical engineering course, where every single day I had to go both to college as well as to the industry so that I can become a practical mechanical engineer. Loved it. It was a very different experience than anything that I'd experienced right here in India, in Coimbatore. But while that was happening, something else happened. I actually was also smitten by the technology bug, right? I went to a college where initially the computer center was open only for what was called circuit branches at that time. Slowly they opened it up for mechanical engineers. I started playing around. It was until like 8 p.m. They opened it until 2 a.m. It was like a party in the computer center by staying late, just learning new skills. One thing led to the other. I found a job with Infosys. I was very curious in terms of like, hey, mechanical engineer, they were hiring. This is still, I'm talking about the 90s, by the way. I'm dating myself. But after I went to Infosys, something even more, something that occurred to me that was, I thought like I would be an outlier in a company like that, which was definitely a tech company in those days from an IT services company. But I saw people that were, coming from an economics background, a chartered accountancy background, textile and metallurgy engineers just like me, which are non-circuit branches. What occurred to me is obviously Infosys didn't hire me for just because I learned coding on the side. They hired me because I could do problem solving. I could do critical thinking. I brought a sense of curiosity to it, right? So that led me to believe that, those are the skills that are going to be consistent, that are going through irrespective of whatever technology revolution that we go through. So it's actually worth noting that, right? Now, one thing that I want to talk about here on this slide is I know that something similar is happening right now, where there are marketing professionals and analysts right here in Bangalore, maybe some of them are in the room, that have pivoted to AI-based roles because they've picked up skills like predictive modeling and AI tools, right? This is exactly how we think the future is going to be. While degrees are going to be important, skills are going to be the new currency, right? Make no mistake, skills are going to be the new currency. How do we actually ensure that people are continuously upskilling is going to be the biggest thing that we have to look at. Like I said, they did not change degrees or pedigree. Instead, they upskilled, right? This is the mantra of how I think we will see organizations invest in individuals as well as individuals invest in themselves. On something like this, while this is happening, professionals are thinking, what type of AI skills should I get, or what is top of mind for professionals, right? Again, our data actually talks about both the global and the Indian context. It's important, I see a lot of leaders here in the room, it's important to see what is driving a professional, right? What could be driving a leader could be different than what is driving probably an entry-level professional. You can see this is kind of what's top of mind, right? 63% across all generations are overwhelmed by how quick their jobs are changing. This is on a global scale, by the way. The next one is 62% of professionals are convinced that they have to have an AI skill. 62%. I'll show you a number on the India, which is even more compelling. The last thing is, there's a lot of young professionals, they know that they need to change course because they're entering the career and there's so much disruption happening, they don't know what skills they need to get, right? This is the global context. Now, when you come to the Indian context, 82% of professionals plan to look for a new job this year. 82%. 82% of professionals plan to look for a new job this year. 78% of Indian professionals are optimistic about the ability. Like I said, this is the 63% overwhelmed globally, 82% positive in India, right? This is how the Indian talent is looking at this. The last thing is pretty important, right? 85% of Indian professionals feel like upskilling is going to be so important in terms of how they're going to invest their time. 85% are very clearly convinced that they're going to invest in upskilling. Now, if you think about it, if in an AI-first world, professionals are ready. Professionals are actually ready to actually pivot in an AI-first world to gain the AI skills. What should organizations be doing, right? Let's look at that. Before we get into that, I thought I'll share a personal story. This is regarding my younger one, who's going to be entering teenage in a couple of weeks, which I'm more nervous about. But we'll talk about, a parent-teachers meeting that I ended up going. This was like 2 years ago. She's going to be 13. She was 11 at that time. So this happened, a little over 2 years ago, I would say. And, usual stuff. We met the teacher. How is she doing? Is she getting into trouble? Is she okay in school? As we were just about to leave, the teacher leans in and says, I want to share something. And she goes, I gave a project to your daughter's class 2 weeks ago, and last week everybody turned it in. One of her friends just told me that she actually used ChatGPT to finish her project work, right? I couldn't know that, a single sentence like that would elicit a completely opposite reaction in my wife and me, right? My wife was upset. She was like, oh, you know what? Our daughter cheated, right? Me, on the other hand, you know what? My child is actually starting to experiment with technology, with actually using the resources at her disposal. I thought it was pretty fascinated. And anyway, it ended up being a good discussion with with the teacher. And something that actually really caught my attention when I left the conversation was the teacher's approach. We talked about it. She's like, hey, you work in technology. How do you think this is going to evolve? We talked about it. And then as we were leaving, she said, based on what you just said, I think I need to change as to probably how I have to evaluate kids. If your daughter is probably one of the first ones to use it, I have to probably say I can give project work fully that can be done at home, right? Maybe I assume they will use these tools, come back, and then I have to build on top of that for a part 2 in class, and then actually really evaluate how they're doing. That discussion actually left something with me that I felt like there's something to learn from that. I can tell you over the last couple of years, I've gone back to that conversation multiple times because as organizations, if you think about when our employees are actually pushing the boundaries of what can be done with AI, instead of actually having a lot of the reasons around like governance, check in with this, check in with that, are we really actually empowering our talent to actually go beyond and actually bring AI skills to bear, right? So I feel as organizations, it's a big responsibility to make sure that you're supporting innovation and not necessarily actually stifling it, right? Actually, on that slide, just to share, I think my daughter would be proud as well because I wanted to create a slide that showed that the husband was actually elated and the wife was upset. And obviously, I used ChatGPT to generate that. And I explained the story. I'm sure ChatGPT was proud of itself that it had a positive impact on a kid's parent-teachers meeting. So, moving on, if you think about what is the tone we want to set in our organizations, right? What is the tone we want to set? I don't know how many of you have heard about this. I actually use it quite a bit. We talk about building for speed versus building for scale, right? What building for speed means, like, the most important thing that you're focused on, you're actually running pilots, you're doing proof of concepts, that's kind of like, you're trying to innovate faster. Whereas when you build for scale, you're looking at, hey, is this repeatable? Is this reliable? Is this more efficient over the long run? Platform type approach, right? Again, I have been in teams, I've been in organizations where we've comfortably moved between one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. But I feel like the moment in the AI adoption that we are in, unless there is something hard and fast where you have to be to the right, in this case to scale, I would urge everybody to actually build for speed. And what does that actually practically mean, right? Like if you're leaders where you have multiple teams working on different things, sometimes when you want to solve a problem, it's okay to let actually multiple teams use probably different AI tech, different AI solutions, and actually work on the problem. Because right now what you want as an organizational culture is actually get the creative juices flowing in the company, right? Obviously with some guardrails so that people don't go to the extremes, but that is the type of culture you want to build where actually people can go and explore. For that, you actually need to provide a little bit of the psychological safety for them to go try and test out things, right? If you think about an organization, let's say you work for a big organization, Malai, how can I do this at scale? Something that we have seen work, and it's still like a work in progress, by the way, is, if you actually think about, like just like an engineer, break down a big problem into smaller problems, if you can actually empower and enable different pockets within the company to actually reinvent their function to become AI native, that is the way to go, right? Because too much starting at the tone at the top, by the time it comes to the end, it actually fizzles down. If it's bottoms up, it never gets. But I think at the function level, people that understand their domains better, when they start to actually look at this, they're able to influence up, they're able to influence down, sidewards as well. So this is something that I would say I urge all of you to just think about in terms of how you want to build for speed. The other thing I would say is, if you remember the electricity conversation, people are like, oh, I'm going to wait and see how this pans out. Who knows? Just like some companies went irrelevant in that age, we could actually become, like the opportunity cost of not jumping on something AI related right now is so high that you don't want to be on that end, right? We talked about the tone at the top. Let's talk about a culture, right? I think, when we talk about the culture, this particular diagram that I have is probably very familiar to a lot of you. We talk about the comfort zone. I mean, the example I can probably take is for someone like me that doesn't know swimming. What is the comfort zone for me? Right here, land, right? But if I want to actually stretch and learn, most likely, if I just imagine how this is going to happen, my kids know swimming, they're going to be like, hey, get in the pool. I'll probably even want a life jacket, even though it's the shallow side of the pool. That's how scared of water I am. But I'll get in there, maybe start to try to float and so on, right? If it was my bunch of friends, I know what would happen. They would push me to the deep end and say, go figure, right? Obviously, that would actually be a panic creation that's happening. So as leaders, I think it's important to say that, especially where people are actually trying and putting themselves out to try things on AI, the stretch zone is where you want your employees to be, right? I think it's really important. If they're actually in the panic zone, it's your job to actually pull them back, right? I'll tell you, as leaders, everybody has their own style, but it's worth looking at saying, hey, more than normally, you should actually lean in and spend time with your teams here, because it is not the time for delegation and go get this done, because it's unfamiliar territory for everybody, including you. And so if you see people in the panic zone, pull them back, give them the comfort so that they can actually work in that. And the opposite of, like, if you feel like there are people in the comfort zone, I mean, one thing I would say is, again, from the electricity analogy, people that spend too much time in the comfort zone and are wondering everything will be ready, most likely will go to the panic zone directly, right? So I think it's very important to make sure that as leaders, continuously looking at, are the teams actually in the stretch zone? And you're giving them the psychological safety to do that, right? I think that's an important part of setting your team up so that even if they fail, they know that you got their back, right? Now that we've talked about like experimentation and like, moving fast, now let's look at, what the skills that are required to actually, execute on this are going to be, right? We're going to look at LinkedIn skills on the RISE report. By the way, this report is public. You can go look it up. It's called LinkedIn Skills on the RISE report 2025. We released it a few months ago. It's worth looking at this. While I share the data, it'll be obvious to you, but I'll just make a call out, right? On the tech and AI skills, you're going to see a lot of the skills being impacted because of the AI adoption, very clearly. And then on the human skills, you're going to see that some of that are still very relevant as they were, and they will continue to be. Now, if you look at the top 5 skills that came up on the tech and AI side, the top 3 probably a few years ago was not even in anybody's dictionary, but they are more common right now. AI literacy and prompt engineering and familiarity with LLMs are obviously the top, as you would imagine. The prompt engineering always reminds me of how I have actually looked at leadership. I read it somewhere or heard somewhere that stuck in my head is leadership is not about having the answers, but asking the right questions, right? Folks that are actually playing with LLMs all day know that if you can ask the right questions, it'll get you what you're looking for. If you don't know what you're looking for, it's going to give you crap, right? So I think it's an important skill. Something actually to talk about that as well is, I can tell you when I was a kind of an entry-level engineer, a lot of my seniors actually used to tell me that, early years, keep your heads down, focus on execution. You can work on your leadership aspects later, right? Honestly, until a few years ago, that is what I was telling junior engineers as well. But given what we are seeing with a lot of tools being available to do a lot of the jobs, I think folks have to get on picking up a lot of these human skills that I'll talk about much earlier on than what it was. Because there used to be this big execution early part of the career mantra that I think is slowly fading away. The fourth one is obviously something that's impacted because of AI. A lot of you here would know. 3 years ago, that would have read just coding or programming. Now it talks about code review and debugging skills. Obviously, with the assumption that more of the coding is actually going to be done by the tools, so you're going to be the human in the loop. Are you actually having the right skills to actually go review and debug, right? So that's another skill that's impacted by AI. As much as we talk about a lot of the changes, there's also something pretty solid in terms of foundation, obviously making sure your data structures is strong, right? That is still something that goes on. These are the human skills that came up as the top skills, right? Something I want to call out. People, even after I put the slide, I thought maybe it is going to look like LinkedIn went and did, hey, let's go and do something on tech and AI skills, and then let's go do something on human skills. Just to share with all of you, that's not how we did it. We looked at all skills, right? And these human-centric skills also came up to the top 10. Pretty fascinating, right? In the sense of as much as some of the what you would call hard technical skills are changing on the top 5, these human-centric skills are also important. Like I said, previously when at least you could go and sit in front of the computer and code your way through for a majority of the day, I think those days are being gone. So your ability to communicate, collaborate, and all of that is going to be super important for you in terms of how you spend your time, right? If you just look at some of the examples, empathy, like I said, you can do anything you want. I know people here have been on both sides. I would imagine where, as much as it's work, you're going through something personally to go actually have a conversation. It doesn't even have to be a manager, right? To a colleague and have that sense of bonding. I think empathy is something that will continue to be in our top, and I think that is just not changed. If you talk about communication and collaboration, obviously I've been around for some time where first when email came, people are like, hey, you know what? We don't have to have as many meetings. I don't have to talk to as many people. I'll just send an email. Then Teams came along, and people are like, I'll just send offline messages. I don't need to. No way, right? Communication and collaboration continue to be even more important. As somebody that works in a global company, I can tell you, one of the things that we prioritize is making sure that people travel to different locations and make sure that we have the relationships that are built, because communication and collaboration are super important, especially as we go to things that are changing so fast. If you're not on the same page, if you're not communicating, if you're not collaborating, I don't think we're achieving what we can as a team. On the creative problem solving, I can probably go back to my daughter. She saw a problem, she decided to get creative about it in terms of using tools. I know as employees, a lot of our employees do that as well in terms of getting creative of how you can do problem solving. So these are, the tech and AI skills that are, showed up in our Skills on the Rise report. Something that I'll say here, right, is as much as these skills are, we've divided into tech and human, it's important to say that having a combination of this is really what is going to make professionals successful. Which means even organizations, as they spend time on this, how they evaluate talent is going to be very key in terms of how they do this, right? It is not going to be as much as on hey, lines of code created, right? Those were the number of PRs pulled. All of that is going to change. And so a combination of this is going to be important even for organizations. Now, if you remember I was saying that, it's AI is, from an India perspective, it is actually a moment of reckoning for AI in India, right? And why I say that, right? Here is some more data points for you, just in terms of what we've observed. AI skill penetration is among the highest in India. If you remember what I was saying, where the West would do it and then we would actually come back later, that's not the case here, right? The AI skill penetration is among the highest in India. 4 out of 5 Indian professionals want to learn about how to use AI in the profession. If you saw that numbers in the previous slide I shared, globally it is 2/3, and then whenever you come to India, it's like 75–80%, right? Because there's a lot more positive energy of how people are thinking about like deploying AI in their work. This is an interesting stat we always love at LinkedIn. India learners spend, as all of you know, we have a LinkedIn learning platform, so we track how much time people from different countries actually spend time on. India learners spend 50% more time than their global counterparts. So if you think that we're talking about asking people to like reskill and upskill, obviously it comes with a lot of learning. I've always joked around that like, it's in our DNA that like if you say, hey, we need to go get this stuff done, here's an exam, I think we have like this amazing DNA to go get this done, right? So from that perspective, I think knowing what skills, if you see what I like correlate what I've talked about, 70% of young professionals said they're looking for where to go skill themselves, right? Here we are saying that they're also spending 50% more time learning, which means helping them identify the right skill that they should be trained on and make sure we match supply and demand, like a truly marketplace effort is really what will actually go a long way. When you think about from my India business leaders perspective, it's pretty telling that it's not even a technology priority for them, but really more a business priority, right? That is how they see in terms of how AI is. Entry-level hiring, this is an important one. I talked about demographic dividend. We have so much of young talent coming through in the ranks. It is nice to see that 56% more in terms of like where compared to pre-pandemic levels, it's gone up, which means making sure that this talent is ready for the new AI era, I think is probably like of paramount importance for us. I'll mention a couple of things here, right? If you think about the IT service revolution, if you call it, that happened like in the 90s in India, I believe that is one of the first meaningful involvement of India in a technology revolution as it was happening. But I feel like it was, even though India was coming up with the solutions, the problems were what the world defined, right? We were executing on them. But I think given all the work that we've done in those particular industries, as well as the thriving startup ecosystem we have in India, I think we're really well set for a leap in the AI era, right? We just need to get our talent reskilled in the right way, and we are set up for the leap there. Talking about leap, I can also say that it's something very uniquely Indian of how we've actually leapfrogged a couple of revolutions, right? If you think about us skipping the landline and just going directly to the mobile revolution. Again, we didn't have like an account for every single citizen in a brick and mortar banking system, but we have this amazing digital public infra that we have from a payments ecosystem today, which means I think even the AI revolution, I don't think we should look at it with a sense of fear, but more an ability or moment to actually leapfrog, right? With that, I will leave you with a couple of questions. I would like to always leave with like folks for them to think. Like I said, I think folks here, honestly, are the ones that are actually going to have a huge impact on how we actually make or break what happens in this particular era, right? So one thing I would ask, I know all of you, the reason you're even here at Cypher is because you want to know what's going on, you want to learn, so it's not about you, right? Think about who you're going to help reskill or upskill. It's an important part of how you give back as technologists to the team, to the organization, to the country. The next one is, how are you creating space for learning within your teams or community? Ultimately, we are all social animals. We live in all these different communities. How are you thinking, how you're encouraging learning across all of these different teams and communities? With that, I will wrap it up. Thank you.